So now that we've eaten, and mercifully we have not been asked to think very much, let me ruin that for you. I'm going to ask you to do something that most people in most rooms are quietly hoping that nobody will ever ask them to do. I'm going to ask you to take a question very seriously. Not to solve it, not to answer it, just to take it seriously. But before I tell you what the question is, let me say what the next 4 weeks are not. This is not a self-help class. This is not therapy. And this is not a class where I'm going to answer the hardest questions that we have. I want to tell you that up front. I'm not going to be able to answer the question that I haven't asked yet. I can't answer it. Nobody who has ever taught Torah honestly has ever answered this question. So what we're going to do instead is something I think is more interesting and more useful. We're going to look at how our tradition has held the question for thousands of years without ever flinching from it. So here's the question. Why do bad things happen to good people? That's it. That's the whole question. And almost every person in this room has asked this question at least once in their life. God forbid, maybe in a hospital hallway, maybe at a funeral, maybe at 3 a.m. when no one else was listening. Maybe you've asked it about your own life. Maybe you've asked it about someone else's life. And here's what I want to say right at the start. If you have ever asked that question and felt a little guilty about asking it, like you're being disrespectful or showing a weakness of faith, this class is for you. Because here's what our tradition is going to show us, starting right now. The question is not a problem. The question, in fact, is the proof. Let me start with a story that contains all of today's lesson in miniature. I would imagine that some people are familiar with this story. You can find it in Elie Wiesel's book, Night. The story goes like this. Elie Wiesel was 14 years old in Auschwitz, in a barracks with some very esteemed rabbis. One evening, after working hard all day, he watched something happen in the barracks that he never forgot. 3 rabbis, scholars he had studied with, teachers of his, decided to convene a court. They put God on trial for cruelty, for betrayal of the Jewish people, for abandoning his covenant. They examined the evidence. They searched for any extenuating circumstances. They couldn't find any. They found God guilty of betrayal of the Jewish people. And then after the verdict, Elie Wiesel writes, there was silence. And then, after the silence, The head of the tribunal looked up at the sky and said, "It's time to daven Mariv. It's time to pray the evening prayer." And they all stood up and they prayed the evening service. Hold on to that image. Because in that single moment, in that single barracks, in that single act, is everything we're going to spend the next 4 weeks unpacking. These were men of faith, profound faith, faith that had survived what no faith should ever have to survive. And their faith was strong enough to find God guilty and then to pray to him anyway. Most religions in the world, if you describe that scene to them, would tell you that those rabbis lost their faith or that they had crossed a line or that they had committed something close to blasphemy. Our tradition says the opposite. Our tradition looks at that moment and recognizes it as one of the holiest acts of devotion ever recorded. The verdict and the prayer are not opposites. They're two faces of the same devotion. And the rest of today is about showing you that this is not new. This is not modern. This is not a response to the Holocaust. This is what our tradition has been doing since the very first time a Jew opened his mouth to God. You might assume that arguing with God is something the rabbis came up with later, some kind of coping mechanism that we developed after enough centuries of things going not so well for the Jewish people. It's not. It's there from the very beginning of the Torah. If you open up the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, turn to the 18th chapter, God has just decided to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. The cities have earned their judgment. And before God acts, the Torah does something that I think is very easy to read too quickly. God says, I am about to do something that will require, let's look at Bereshit, Genesis chapter 18, verse 17 through 19. I will read to you. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham is to become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed through him. For I have known him to the end that he may command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice. Think about what's happening here. The creator of the universe is asking himself out loud. The Torah is recording a conversation between God and himself, asking whether or not he should consult a human being before carrying out a judgment. You see what's going on here? Why? Why bother telling Abraham? Why give Abraham the standing to object? Why not just act? The Torah, in the same verse that I just read, gives us the answer. Verses 18 and 19, listen to the logic. God says, I'm about to consult Abraham because I have chosen him to teach his children and their children to do righteousness and justice. And then, in the very same breath, God says, I'm about to do something that will require him to challenge me in the name of these exact values. God is inviting the argument. In the verses where he designates Abraham as the father of the Jewish people, he hands him a test case on which Abraham will have to challenge God on a question of justice. And Abraham does exactly what he was chosen for. He doesn't bow his head. He doesn't say, whatever you say, I will do, master of the universe. He says famously, the most famous uts in all of the Torah, he says to God, will the judge of all the earth not do justice? He gives it to him. Think about that for a moment. Abraham, who in the very same chapter, 2 verses later, calls himself a gornished, a nothing, dust and ashes, looks up at the creator of all things and says, you of all beings must be held to a standard of justice. And then he begins the bargain. You know the story, right? If I can find 50 righteous people, will you save the cities from destruction? What about 45? What about 40? It looks like Machne Yehuda in the Shuk, a bargain going on. Like a man at the market. With a creator of the universe, he's bargaining. And here's the part that's easy to read past. God never tells him to stop. Bless you. God never says, who are you to question me? God never says, Abraham, that's enough. Time out. God engages. He answers each number. He goes down with him, step by step. Because this is exactly why God brought Abraham into this conversation. And this moment, chapter 18 in Genesis, is the founding moment of prayer in the Torah. Not submission, argument. Argument as covenant. So to be a stiff-necked people is not necessarily a pejorative. We are not the children of Abraham because he submitted. We're the children of Abraham because he argued on behalf of strangers in a wicked city for the sake of justice. That's our covenant. And holy protest is not a violation of that covenant. It is the covenant. Questions, comments? Larry asked the question, was he testing Abraham or did he already know? If we juxtapose this story with the story of Noah, he also tested Noah. We don't necessarily see it, but now that we've laid this as foundation, we can look at Noah and see the test. When he says, I'm going to destroy the entire earth, build an ark for 120 years, and then I'm going to drown everybody but you and your family. Not one time in those 120 years did Noah even approach anybody else to try to save them. He didn't have one single convert in 120 years. He just dealt with his own family, and that was it. Juxtapose this with Abraham. Clear choice who's supposed to lead the Jewish people. Not Noah, but Abraham. Dr. Jeff. He was not testing, he was challenging. He was challenging God to show up as God. Say again? Was this Abraham's test of his own faith? For Abraham, it was definitely a test. Yes, for sure. So if Abraham establishes this pattern, let's turn to Moses, who inherits this pattern. Open the book of Exodus, chapter 5, verse 22. Moses has just completed everything God asked him to do. Remember at the burning bush, Charlton Heston, remember all that? He's gone back to Egypt. He stood before Pharaoh. He spoke in God's name. And what was the result? Dafka, absoluchus. The opposite. Pharaoh made things worse. The slaves now have to gather their own straw without changing the quota. People are being beaten and killed. And Moshe turns to God and says, in your source 3, chapter 5, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done worse to this nation, and you have not saved your people at all. How's that for chutzpah? This is not a polite question. This is the greatest prophet our people will ever have, accusing God in plain language of doing evil. And what's fascinating is God's response. What's God's response? God doesn't rebuke him. God doesn't explain himself. God does not answer the why. God simply promises it will turn out. You will see what I do next. Now, some of the classical commentators, a lot of them, read the story as a moment when Moses failed. A moment that he stepped out of line, as if he had been impertinent. But Hasidus looks at this differently. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, of righteous memory, said the exact opposite. The Rebbe taught that crying out, "Why have you done evil?" can only come from the mouth of a true believer. Just think about it. If you don't believe in God, the question makes no sense. If the universe is random, if there's no one minding the store, if suffering is just what suffering is, you don't ask why, you just shrug your shoulders and move on. A non-believer can only shrug his shoulders at the universe. Only a believer can cry out why. Because only the believer is in a relationship intimate enough to be wounded by the silence. So here again, the protest is the faith. Gene. You're saying that in one instance, you're saying in the case of Abraham, we see a bad outcome? And in the case, I'm not quite sure what you're saying, Gene. Okay, so there were not even 10 righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah, so therefore, Nishkaferlach, done deal. Okay, now let's go to Moses and? Exactly. 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 What does that show us? What does that show us? God what? Ah, God listens. We can have an influence on God. Excellent point. That moment that Gene just described, that you just mentioned, is such a defining moment when Moses makes a choice to take the side of the Jewish people against God. And that's where God goes, I take my hat off to you, okay. You get what you want. I lose, you win. That's what he was waiting for. It didn't work out, but also, if you notice, Abraham gave up. After the number 10, he stops and he turned to the next scene because he realizes if there's not even a minion of righteous people, what's the point of this? Neta. Neta is bringing up the fact that in this week's Parsha, as a matter of fact, in this week's Torah portion, Moses, for striking the rock instead of speaking to it, is sentenced to die in exile rather than to cross into the land of Israel. Seems like a pretty severe punishment, no? That's one reading of it. Another reading is that it wasn't a punishment at all. If Moses had gone into Israel and led the Jewish people into Israel, Mashiach would have come immediately. It would have been done. We wouldn't be here today eating knish and smoked salmon. If you think that this pattern stops with a Torah, it doesn't stop with the Torah. It runs through the prophets. It runs through the writings. It runs through every generation of our spiritual lineage. If you turn to the book of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, chapter 12, verse 1. Don't forget who Jeremiah was. He's the prophet who watched with his own eyes the temple fall. He watched Jerusalem burn. He lived through what is arguably the worst catastrophe in Jewish history until the modern Khurban in Germany. And here's what he says to God in the book of Yirmiyahu, the book of Jeremiah, chapter 12, the first verse. He says, "You're righteous, God, yet I'm going to argue with you anyway. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why are all those who deal treacherously at ease?" You hear that? He says, God, you're right, but I'm going to argue with it anyway. Both clauses at the same time. You're right, and I'm still complaining. That's something we do very well, no? This is not contradiction. This is being Jewish. This is being human. This is our tradition saying, I trust you, and I'm not angry with you. I believe you're just, and I don't understand what the heck you're doing. Both at once, without any resolution, without one canceling the other. Try saying that with any other religious tradition and see what kind of look you get. Try saying that in our tradition, and you'll see that you just quoted the prophet Jeremiah. Three figures: Abraham, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah. Three different protests. Three different moments in the story of suffering. In the case of Abraham, before the suffering had even happened, argues on behalf of strangers in a wicked city. Will the judge of the earth not do justice? Moses in the middle of the people suffering. Why have you done evil to this people? Jeremiah, God, you're righteous, but I'm going to argue with you anyway. Three different voices, one tradition. And then 2,000 years later, three rabbis in barracks in Auschwitz find God guilty, and then they turn around and they pray the evening prayer. My dear friends, this is who we are. A people whose holiest figures never pretended to understand. A people whose scripture preserves their complaints rather than editing them out. That's why the Talmud is 2.5 million words. Because we preserve the losing arguments right along with the winning arguments. We are a people who have learned painfully, generationally, that the question is not the enemy of faith. In fact, the question may be the deepest evidence of faith that there could possibly be. Because to ask why is to assume there's somebody listening. To say this is not just is to assume that justice is real. To complain to God is to confess, without realizing it, that God is still the one you believe in. Barbara. For sure. So you should feel good about arguing. Gail.
So the piece that's missing from the discussion is not man to God. The piece that's missing from this discussion is man to man. And I guess you're going to get to that.
Yeah, we got 4 weeks to. We're going to go.
I mean, that's what's missing from this little discussion. We're saying, can we question God? But the piece that's missing is where is man to man. So I'm assuming that that's coming.
That will be coming later, along with a lot of other goodies. We're going to spend the entire next session inside the longest meditation on suffering in all of Scripture. Anybody know what that is? Louder? The book of Job, the book of Eov, a righteous man who lost everything, 3 friends who try to explain to him why he deserved it, a God who actually answers Job, but not the way Job was expecting. In the third session, we're going to meet a figure from the Talmud who carried in silence what Job expressed out loud. In the final session, we'll turn not to an answer, because there are none, but to a posture, a way of living alongside the unanswered. So I told you weren't going to get any answers. But I want to leave you with a question for today. Not a question that you have to share, not a question you need to discuss, a question to carry with you. Somewhere in your life, there's a question you have not allowed yourself to bring to God. Maybe because it felt disrespectful. Maybe because you weren't sure whether he could take it or you could take it. But I want to say, after today, Abraham brought his question, Moshe brought his, Yirmiyahu brought his, 3 rabbis in Auschwitz brought theirs, and not one of them was rebuked for it. Maybe it's time to bring your question. Questions? Comments? Larry?
How many times did these people, like Moses, actually change God's mind? I know it's 1 or 2.
I can't give you a number, but we see case after case throughout Torah. Look, what is the whole basis of the Nevi'im, of the prophets? What is the prophet's job? The prophet's job is to get the Jews to repent so God will change his mind. And in the case of all the prophets, there's only one prophet that was ever listened to. Who was that prophet? Only one time in the book of prophets was there a prophet that the people listened to and actually repented. It was Jonah. It was Jonah the prophet. Say it again. Say it again. Exactly. They weren't Jews that he was prophesying to. And they listened. He was talking to the Assyrians. And they listened. Just saying.
Is that why you always go and teach Christians?
Okay.
When you give the class to the non-Jews up in North Georgia, do they listen better than we do?
Yes.
Yeah, they take notes also.
The answer is yes.
Okay, before we wrap up, I had a few thoughts on this week's Torah portion on the Parsha that I'd like to share with you. A neighbor loses a parent. And you think about stopping by. You rehearse what you're going to say, like, I'm sorry for your loss, or he's in a better place. And then you realize that's not going to cut it. I can't say stuff like that. But the moment passes and you end up not going because it's weird, because you're not comfortable with grief. So you blow off going to the funeral, to the house of Shiva, because you don't know what to say. It's not your thing. If that is your thing, then I'm sure there's something else that isn't your thing. We all have our comfort zones. And usually that's fine, but not always. This week's Torah portion, called Chukat, which means statute, you find it in the book of Numbers, chapters 19 through chapter 22. In the middle of it, the Jewish people suffer two great losses in quick succession. Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron, passes away. Immediately afterwards, second verse, chapter 20, the congregation had no water. Jewish tradition explains that a miraculous well had accompanied the people of Miriam's merit. When she died, the well disappeared. And the people complained loudly. Soon after, Aaron, the high priest, the man of love and compassion and priesthood, dies. And the protective clouds of glory that had surrounded the nation and protected us, the clouds that shielded us from all danger, disappeared. And yet this time the Torah does not record an outcry. The Talmud tells us the clouds came back almost immediately. This time they came back in Moses' merit. But that raises a question. The clouds had always been associated with Aaron. Aaron was the peacemaker. He was the goody-goody, the one who always pursued peace between two people. How did they possibly return for Moses, a completely different kind of personality? Hasidic masters offer a striking reading. Moses did not become a different person. Rather, he became responsive to a different need of the people. Until then, until that moment, Moses' role had been to guide, to lead, with attention to each person's situation. But now the people needed something else. They needed protection. They needed unity. They needed stability. They needed strokes. The kind of care that flowed naturally through a guy like Aaron. Now Moses had to step into a role he was not comfortable or familiar with. It was not natural, but it was necessary. And here's what blows me away about this teaching. We often define ourselves by what comes easily to us. I'm not that kind of person. I'm not good at this. I'm not good at that. That's not my thing. And within reason, those instincts help us live with focus. But sometimes somebody else's need calls us past them. And in those moments, the question changes. It's no longer, what am I comfortable doing? It becomes, what am I needed for right now? So the question that I want to leave you with today, by the way, I see a few conditions still on the table. Where might someone you love be quietly waiting for you to step past what's natural into what's needed? And with that, my dear friends, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. Congratulations. Congratulations, everybody with a simcha. Ellen, may all your family and ancestors have a big aliyah into the seventh heaven. Whoever would like to sponsor the next Taste and Torah event, please see Rabbi Solish. Please feed the pushka. Please take the knish. And there's birthday cake. Go have a piece of birthday cake. Thank you very much.